Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating place. We're talking about a nation literally forged in the fires of extreme geography, shaped by ancient empires and tested by some seriously profound modern crises. Yep, we're talking about Tajikistan. It's this incredible spot where the heavy weight of history collides with the raw, absolute power of nature. And honestly, getting a grip on Tajikistan is like finding the master key to understanding all of Central Asia. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll scale the roof of the world. Then we'll look back at a Persian golden age and its lost cities. After that, we'll navigate through empires and some pretty arbitrary borders before confronting the abyss of independence and civil war. Finally, we'll break down the modern strongman state and wrap up with the urgent stakes of water, climate, and tomorrow. Let's get right into it. Part 1. The Roof of the World, a Geographic Paradox. You know, geography here isn't just some pretty background scenery. It is literally the defining character of the entire country. Get this, a staggering 90% of Tajikistan is just mountains. 90%. That includes the massive Ismaili Samoni Peak scraping the sky at nearly 7,500 meters. This rugged terrain is part of the Pamir Range, which people often call the roof of the world. And it physically isolates the country. It makes basic things like transportation, farming, and central government control incredibly difficult. But here's the crazy paradox of all this extreme geography. Despite being one of the poorest nations in the region, Tajikistan sits on a mind-blowing 97.1% of Central Asia's total water resources. Because of those giant snow-capped mountains and glaciers, almost all that regional water flows right through Tajikistan. It's a massive source of natural wealth, but, as we're going to see a bit later, it's also a deeply complicated trap. All right, part 2, a golden age and lost cities, the Persian heartland. To really get Tajikistan, we have to rewind and see how this rugged, mountainous zone was actually once the thumping heart of a massive cultural golden age. Historically, the ground here was constantly shifting under the weight of different empires. Back in the 9th century, the Persian-speaking Samanid dynasty built this brilliant, incredibly wealthy state all across Central Asia. Then boom, the 13th century hits, and Genghis Khan's Mongol invasions bring absolute, total devastation. By the 14th century, things start looking up again, with a huge architectural rebirth under the Timurid Empire. But jump forward a few centuries, and the Russian Empire begins its annexation, completely changing the trajectory for the Tajik people forever. And this leads to a really tragic loss of heritage. Think about the legendary cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. These were the absolute crown jewels of the Samanid Empire. We're talking the epicenters of the Islamic Golden Age, famous for Persian poetry, cutting-edge science, and just breathtaking architecture. But when the modern borders were finally drawn up, both of these historical cultural capitals ended up outside Tajikistan, in modern-day Uzbekistan. The modern Tajik state was literally stripped of the very cities that birthed its culture. Just imagine what that does to a national identity. Which brings us to part 3. Empires and arbitrary borders, the Great Game and Soviet slicing. Let's look at exactly how those borders were drawn up while empires were clashing over the roof of the world. So this entire setup is a highly engineered history. Back in the late 19th century, Tsarist Russia annexed the territory. This was all part of the Great Game, that intense geopolitical chess match with Britain. Fast forward to 1924, and the Soviet Union steps in to carve out the Tajik Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. But they drew these totally arbitrary borders that just completely ignored the historical and ethnic realities on the ground. Later on, the Soviets actually forced massive numbers of Tajiks to relocate down into the valleys just to grow cotton. The whole region was systematically kept underdeveloped, fragmented, and totally reliant on that single cash crop. Part 4. Independence and Civil War, the abyss of independence. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, Tajikistan didn't just peacefully glide into independence. No, it plunged straight into an absolute abyss. The human toll from the power vacuum that followed was just staggering. Somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 lives were lost in a really brutal civil war that tore through the country from 1992 to 1997. You had competing political factions, regional clans, and ideological groups all fiercely fighting for control over this newly independent but completely fractured nation. And right alongside that violence was a total economic freefall. Remember that Soviet cotton dependency we just talked about? Well, during the war, the output of cotton, which was the country's main export, plummeted by 54%. Industrial output was shattered. Infrastructure was virtually annihilated. The conflict essentially pushed the country decades backward in its development. This cascading devastation meant survival at home was nearly impossible for everyday citizens. Over 1 million Tajiks had absolutely no choice but to leave the country just to find bread-earning work, with most migrating to Russia. This kicked off a massive demographic shift, and it started this heavy reliance on foreign money being sent back home, a dynamic that still completely defines the nation today. Moving on to Part 5, the modern strongman state, consolidation and stagnation. Let's see how the government was reconstructed from the ashes of that terrible war. Today's political reality is really defined by strict consolidation. President Emomali Rahmon has been in power since 1994, which actually makes him one of the longest-serving heads of state in all of post-Soviet Central Asia. Over the decades, his government has systematically eliminated political opposition and shut down independent media. The top elite positions, they're heavily dominated by loyalists and family members. Now, while this top-down control definitely created internal stability and ended the wartime violence, it relies heavily on state security forces. And the result is a severely authoritarian state where the economy has essentially stagnated. And that political consolidation translates into a pretty harsh everyday socioeconomic reality. By 2015, over 60% of the lower class in Tajikistan was living in extreme poverty. Because the internal economy hasn't seen any deep modernization, the country remains incredibly, almost dangerously reliant on those external remittances from citizens working abroad just to keep its head above water. Finally, Part 6, Water, Climate, and Tomorrow, the geopolitical stakes. We really need to understand why Tajikistan's future isn't just a local issue. It's actually a matter of urgent global security and environmental survival. Major global powers care deeply about this small, landlocked nation because it is an absolute geopolitical linchpin. Tajikistan shares a massive 1,300-kilometer, super rugged border with Afghanistan. That makes it a major transit point on the east-west drug route, a vital intelligence source for both Russia and the West, and a strategic buffer against extremism. Basically, it's ground zero for a new great game playing out in Central Asia right now. But honestly, the highest stakes here might be environmental. Remember that wild statistic from earlier? They possess 97.1% of Central Asia's total water resources, but they have virtually no reservoirs to actually store it. Think about that. They have this massive, life-giving resource, but lack the infrastructure to control it. And that sets up a highly, highly precarious trap. Here's how it plays out. First, the glaciers provide this immense rush of water during the summer thaws. Second, because they can't store it, Tajikistan is forced to just let that excess water go during the flood seasons. Third, downstream nations, places like Uzbekistan, rely entirely on the summer release for their own agriculture. But the fourth step is where the alarm bells really start ringing. Climate change is threatening to melt these glaciers prematurely. If those glaciers disappear, the entire regional water supply is completely disrupted. So, that leaves us with this major pressing question. As the glaciers melt, as the border with Afghanistan remains incredibly tense, and as an aging authoritarian regime holds on to power, who is ultimately going to control the future of Central Asia's water? The stability of an entire region is balancing right now on the geographic razor's edge of Tajikistan. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.